Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Álvaro Rojas. I work at the United Nations University, and I'm very happy that you guys are here and we get to share together this session on mobility, on the Mobility Day here in the Capacity Building Hub. Sorry, we're starting a bit late. Is there a pointer or? Yeah. So we're gonna try to keep the session today a bit interactive. We're gonna have Menti to support us doing that. We're gonna have some breakout sessions to discuss today. We're gonna have some input in the spirit of the capacity building. There is no assumption that everybody has the exact same level of knowledge. We have a very interesting session as well about the topic of migration. So we're just trying to keep it very accessible. So yeah, again, I can see it here. The title of the session is Bridging Capacity, Climate, and Migration in this day. And we are honored to have today a very interesting panel. We have Ms. Alexandra Bilac. She's the director on the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. We have Dr. Robert Oakes. He's part of UNU family, Associate Academic Officer at EMIC. And we have Mr. Andrea Milan, Senior Project Manager at the Global Center for Climate Mobility. As I said, we're going to have a dynamic session. There are going to be some questions here in which we first get to know a little bit about you. Then we're going to have some keynotes, and then we're going to try to use this space to have more open discussions. So yeah, we really count on your energy. I know it's Saturday afternoon. Maybe some of you, maybe all of us are a little bit tired running from one place to another, not eating much, but yeah, that's an important topic, so I'm very, very thankful you are joining us now. So to join Menti, I don't know, is everyone familiar with the tool? So there are two options. You can go to menti.com. This works computer, tablets, laptop, anything. And you can use this code, the one everywhere, this 88080882, or you can use the QR code. Okay, is it better? Thank you. So, yep, you will always have the option to thumb me up, not down. I took that one out. And then you have the option to provide their opinions or questions. This will be shown at the end. This is another option to interact with us. Maybe while you're listening to the keynote, for example, you come up with a question or something, we will collect them and then address them. But as you can see, we will also provide options for you to stand up and share, or during the breakout sessions, directly talk with the speakers. So we're just trying to cover those that are more shy or like to speak louder or everything. During the full session, you will have the code on top. So if you couldn't join already with the QR or something, don't worry about it. You will have options to join. But I saw some people arrive a little later. So if you want to scan the QR code to engage, that would be also really nice. So first question, we want to know who's in the room. As I said, we're not assuming everyone has the same profile or anything else. And we want to know, where do you come from? Like, what's your background? We have 5 options there. Sorry, move, Chris. We have policy and governance, migration expert, data modeling expert, civil society and NGO, research and academia. We know some people have different hats. I think you can only use one option. So today we're going to force you to choose. You can choose more? Okay, then I'm not going to force you to choose. Menti has evolved a lot since COVID times, and now it's much more interesting, I think. We have 10 participants already letting us know. We have a good representation of academics. That's the UNU, I think, network that they're supporting us. We have civil society. We have migration expert and only one modeling expert. I work in the analytics team. My language are numbers. So I think that person would have been the right audience then for me, but I'm just here to moderate. We have 13 inputs. We have a thumbs up. Thank you for the energy. Again, Friday afternoon. Saturday afternoon even, sorry. 3 thumbs up. Okay, this is getting exciting. And we want to know a little bit about how familiar you are with the topic of quantifying weather and related mobility. We have 3 options there. Somebody who's like very involved, developing even the models. Somebody that has used that one, or somebody that has not yet thought even about the possibility of modeling. I know some people have controversial ideas about modeling this topic. You will have the space to let us know why. We have an even share of extremes. I find that interesting. So either you have, or not even thought of it. Oh no, I'm developing models, so we have, okay, better that way. We have somebody that have used the mobility data, some people have not yet thought about it, and very few are developing models and quantifying approaches. Okay, I think we only have 11 so far, but I think that gives us a very good idea where we are. We are a majority or a large group of people here work in academia, and then we know that there are not like the expert modeling room, which is also really nice. But you have, I hope, very much engaged in the topic of mobility. Again, we come back to the list of speakers. We're going to have 3 keynotes. Just remember, anytime you want to ask, we are collecting the questions directly on Menti, but we are going to also provide the opportunity for you to raise your hand or even discuss with the speakers a bit later. So I'm going to start now with Alexandra. If you can join us, please, here, and let us know a little bit more about the work you do on IDMC. You're free, whatever you feel more comfortable, to be honest. You want to sit there? Yeah.
Had I known, I'd have sat down from the beginning, but thank you very much. Thank you, Alvaro, and good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see so many of you joining us today on a Saturday afternoon, and it was really interesting, the findings of the Menti. And just for those of you who are not familiar with this topic, I'm sure that all of us will try and make it as intelligible as possible for all of you. So my name is Alexandra Bilak. I'm the director of IDMC, which is the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. We are a non-governmental organization based in Geneva, and our role is, as a monitoring center, is to monitor the phenomenon of internal displacement across the world. We have been doing this for 25 years. We provide data and analysis on this phenomenon, and we are interested in internal displacement that occurs as a result of conflict and violence, but also disasters, sudden and slow onset disasters. So IDMC, in partnership with the United Nations University, has organized this, this event today, and I'd like to thank the Capacity Building Hub for welcoming us here. And the title of our side event is How Can We Uncover the Risk of Disaster Displacement at the global and at the country level? So I'd like to say, as an introduction, I'd like to say a few words about why we feel that it is important to develop modeling in order to quantify the risk of disaster displacement, and then say a few words about how IDMC has started originally its work on displacement monitoring in partnership with our other institutions here present, but also many other partners in the world, and the opportunities that such approaches can bring for policymakers, for operational actors working at the country level. So just to set the scene, something about the scale of disaster displacement. Before we start talking about the risk of it happening in the future, let's talk about the scale of it today, which is the starting point for why we wanted to think about the future. IDMC started collecting data on disaster and climate-related displacement in 2008. So we only have really 15 years of data and 15 years of experience, which is actually long in some senses, but it's quite a short time frame if you compare it to conflict displacement, which we've been monitoring for much longer. And since we've started collecting data on this phenomenon, we have established that 359 million internal displacements due to weather-related hazards have happened since then. And this is the equivalent of 22.4 million displacements every year worldwide. And if I had prepared a PowerPoint, which I didn't do, but you're very welcome to go on the IDMC website and check out our reports, I would be able to pull up the global map that we publish every year and that shows the geographic distribution of disaster displacement, which of course is predominantly concentrated in certain regions in the world, but is very much a global phenomenon. And it is something that, thanks to our data, we've been able to establish as an issue that affects every country in the world, from low-income to high-income countries. Now, as you also know, the IPCC states now with high confidence that climate change is making weather-related events that trigger this displacement more frequent and more intense. So based on this knowledge, we can only assume that the displacement that we're seeing today may increase in the future. But this is an assumption. And up until recently, the only data that was available to us was the figures that IDMC reports on that comes from an analysis of data on past and ongoing disaster events. And while this data is essential, of course, for understanding what has happened and what is happening today, it does not indicate what may occur in the future, and more importantly, how countries, economies, communities, and individuals can prepare for it. So this is why we felt at IDMC that it was critical to invest in risk analysis in order to support operational and policy decision makers. And what we've seen by investing in this new area of work is that it helps in particular in 4 different ways. The first way, which is quite basic but still very important, is to raise risk awareness. So to really shift the thinking away from what is happening today to what may happen in the future by providing the tools and the methods and equipping governments, policymakers, operational actors with the information that they need to anticipate this future. So it raises risk awareness with information on the specific risks related to displacements that a country may face, and importantly, the potential number of people who can require assistance in such contexts. The second reason why risk analysis is so important is that it enables us to identify and to anticipate displacement hotspots. It allows us to proactively identify those regions that are most likely to be the most vulnerable to displacement before the disasters strike, which also then can allow for anticipatory action, better resource allocation, and of course, early warning. It also empowers, in a third instance, those decision makers with data. So if we can provide probabilistic data and insights into potential displacement scenarios, it equips local actors, national actors with the tools that they need to make informed decisions that can mitigate the negative impacts of displacement as well when it happens. And even though this model that we'll be presenting to you today doesn't intend to inform immediate emergency response, it doesn't have the capacity to do that, it is still a useful tool to guide interventions in the medium to the long term. And finally, such models can also help in building resilience longer term and reducing vulnerability, because it allows us to also understand the underlying drivers and the probability of displacement that can occur as a result of impacts on livelihoods, on resources, and it can therefore provide insights into how to address those underlying vulnerabilities that exacerbate the risk. I'm going to hand over to you in a minute. Rob is the expert behind this model who'll be presenting the model in much more detail. But just to give a sense of the history behind this work, in September 2017, IDMC released its first global displacement risk model, which was very much a baseline for the work that was going to come later. And with this model, we framed displacement through the lens of risk, and it originally focused on sudden onset hazards like earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, cyclonic winds, and storm surges. And that model used housing damage, so data available on damaged homes, as a proxy for displacement. 2 years before we developed the first model, we initially were using historical data to predict future trends. But we realized after a while that this approach was not ideal because it's a deterministic approach and can give the impression that the future is inevitable. So while historical displacement can explain the past, it doesn't necessarily provide a reliable guide for the future. As we often say, most disasters that could happen have not happened yet. So we felt that a probabilistic approach was more appropriate in this regard, as it allows us to view risks somewhat differently. So although it incorporates this new model historical data, it also integrates various scenarios and uses mathematical modeling to estimate the probability of extreme events and events that have not yet happened, to identify where they're most likely to occur and within which time frames. So building on the probabilistic risk modeling that has been developed by UNDRR in its global assessment reports, IDMC in essence has humanized that model by looking not only about how many millions or billions of dollars of assets countries have at risk in the face of disasters, but also now how many people are at risk of becoming displaced. So the non-economic, or at least one component of the non-economic losses of disasters. Since 2017, I'll end here, the journey has been very long and insightful, and we've learned a lot in the process. Robert here will elaborate further on the results of the model, the technicalities of it, what it can do, what it can't do, what are some of the initial findings. We have partnered with a number of institutions. This is a collaborative effort. This isn't something that a single institution, I think, can do alone. And we've very much benefited from the partnership with the United Nations Universities Institute for Environment and Human Security, UNU-EHS, the CHIMA Foundation. They were here with us a couple of days ago, for those of you who attended our other event on risk. With ETH Zurich's Weather and Climate Risk Group, the Earth Observatory of Singapore, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and the University of Valencia. All of these are our partners that are helping us improve this model, its resolution. Some of the variables in that model, we're very interested in better unpacking the concept of vulnerability in order to support much more precise and actionable insights in the future. So we're very proud of this, and I'm going to now hand over to Robert to say more about what this model is all about. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do they need to put the other slides?
Yeah, so I think I like this idea of humanizing. So from my perspective, I think that's what we try to do as UNU. So I think there are a range of researchers, people working in this field, who are really skeptical about models. My own perspective, and I think one which is a kind of collaborative, pragmatic perspective, is that, yeah, maybe you need to be skeptical, but models are here to stay. So let's join forces with the modelers and let's try and do it in the best way possible. And the way we do that, we hope to humanize them. Okay, so yeah, very brief. This is kind of a bit relates to what Alexandra was saying, like the need for modeling. So we have to be careful when we're producing data, when we're producing any knowledge, but when we're producing projections about what's going to happen, we have to be careful about what we're doing. We have to attempt to be communicate exactly what it is the model can and can't do, as Alexandra just mentioned. And when we produce numbers, we have to be careful because we know that the media will run with them. Nonetheless, I think it is true that these processes are driven by data. If we get some numbers, we have more chance of funds eventually trickling into the people who are affected by displacement, and we can address non-economic and economic loss and damage. We can try and promote more adaptive forms of mobility. So just about the model, I'm not going to go into much detail, but you could see at the center here we have the Clamada risk modeling platform, and this is a probabilistic tool that enables a number crunching of a lot of environmental data. So we bring in the hazards, and the hazards that we've just been processing in the last few months relate to floods, storms, and droughts. For floods, riverine floods, and storm surge floods. And in terms of exposure, we've really developed a really more granular level of exposure coming from the Chima Foundation, and getting a real good feel for the populations who are living in these areas. Vulnerability I'm going to talk about in a little bit. So traditionally, vulnerability is an impact function, just a mathematical equation of how people are affected. That's what we're trying to fine-tune and humanize in our role in the project, UNU EHS. And you can see on the far-hand side, what we're actually producing at the end are a few different distinct numbers. So annual average displacements, probable maximum displacements. And this is by country, and some countries we have a admin 1 level, so below country level, and that means that we can produce maps that actually have the impact in a smaller region, and we can generate numbers for the country. We can generate numbers globally, but of course we need to be a little bit careful about how we present those. We can also combine the hazards into a global figure. We have that possibility by adding numbers, but I'm not sure it makes sense at the moment to do that. We're a bit early in the process. Okay, so just to show the sort of thing that we have been producing. So this is storm surge displacement risk for Japan, and the darker colors basically show the increased risk in certain areas of the country. So this is under optimistic scenario, but we have pessimistic scenarios. So we have RCP 2.6 and 8.5, so we can see what might happen under different scenarios, and by 2050 and by the end of the century. So a similar story for river floods displacement. So here you can see that we have global data. I'm not sure it makes sense for me to add up all these numbers, but that data is there. That's something that this tool is sufficiently powerful to generate this, and we feel quite comfortable about our methods at the moment, but we are fine-tuning it. Maybe we'll discuss in a minute where we're going after this. Then drought displacement. This is the one I've been working more on within UNU. So we just zeroing in on Somalia here. So here's some data saying that what we think may happen under the optimistic and the pessimistic scenario. I mean, we have these numbers. I'm not sure I need to go into much detail what those numbers are at the moment, but essentially this is what the tool can do. And I think it is important that we have these optimistic scenarios, pessimistic scenarios. And of course, we hope that these, the differences between these numbers, these are real people, and these are real people who should be thought about next door, etc. Okay, so I do include some global level numbers here. These should be taken with a pinch of salt, and I say it's not maybe useful to combine all hazards, but if we just add up all of the displacements under optimistic scenarios and pessimistic, these are the numbers. In fact, I didn't label them, but these are the average annual displacements that we might assume. And these numbers are quite large relative to what's been published. For example, in the IDMC, the grid report, the annual reports that IDMC do. However, we know that that's underreported. And also what I think is interesting in our model is that we're where is that line between migration and displacement when we're talking about drought? So in reality, people don't have much choice when there is drought. So I think in years to come, we will see more people reported as moving due to drought. So I don't think these numbers are particularly crazy, actually. Okay, but in terms of modeling, what is it that we're actually bringing to the party? So I think that we know this understanding. This is kind of accepted. Maybe it's a simplification. Risk is made of, there's got to be a hazard. There's got to be an exposed population or an exposed ecosystem. And those people are affected if they're vulnerable, or their level of vulnerability. And what we're trying to do is trying to combine these and think how that actually moves into displacement risk and displacement. These are two slightly different ideas. So what happens in most models is that vulnerability is more or less exposure. And this is what Alexandra discussed. The sort of previous approach within the model was to consider that if a house is damaged, if a house is destroyed, those people are vulnerable and displaced. And it's maybe the kind of the easiest way to get data to actually fulfill that gap is through looking at physical vulnerability. What we're trying to do is bringing more, and there's so many different elements of vulnerability. Maybe we'll talk about it in a minute, but I mean, it could be related to your housing, it could be related to your livelihoods, it could be about the infrastructure which you're interacting with, for example. So our challenge is eventually to do all of those. At the moment, we've just been looking more at the livelihoods elements. And I think it's also important to try and think about if and how we're bringing in ideas of, do people need to move? Do they want to move? Can they move? So just briefly, so I put adapting the foresight model here with a question mark. So if you work in climate mobility, you might know this model from understanding climate migration. Now, climate migration is not displacement, accepted. However, because there is this kind of spectrum between what is migration, what is displacement, we're just trying to think of maybe integrating ideas from migration to come into displacement. What are the range of factors which might be influencing people's vulnerability and why they move? So what we have here, more or less on the left-hand side, these factors, political, demographic, economic, social, environmental, they combine and make people need to or want to move. And this is somewhat the case within displacement as well. Within drought, it works perhaps more clearly because there's a bit more kind of processing time than with a storm surge. And then we're also thinking about capability. So can people actually move? So if they want to move, are they able to? And until now, this is very difficult to model. So this is kind of a plan as well as what we've been doing. So I'll just wrap up very quickly, but this is how we're trying to look at vulnerability in terms of drought at the moment. So we're trying to represent that pentagon of a range of factors using some indicators that we can get at a global level and lower if possible. Okay, so in fact, yeah, maybe we'll move on there.
Maybe we can move back to the Menti if it's possible. Thanks. So we have our final key speaker. Keynote speaker, could you please continue, Andrea, and introduce yourself? Thank you.
Of course, thank you. My name is Andrea Milan, and I'm a senior project manager for the Rising Nations Initiative at the Global Center for Climate Mobility, where we advance evidence-based solutions to address challenges and opportunities related with climate mobility. And today I will share briefly 3 things. One is I'll share what the Global Center has done over the past couple of years to model mobility in Africa, in the Greater Caribbean, and then I will share some of the lessons learned from a currently open collection of papers specifically on climate mobility modeling that is going to be finalized on the academic journal Frontiers in Climate. I should also add that this is my second week with the Global Center for Climate Mobility, but I was still sent here because I was part of the technical advisory group that worked on both models. So in fact, I know them from having collaborated with the researchers back then. But you will pardon me if I don't remember the specific details during the Q&A. So the first model that was developed by the center was the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative related model. Now, this model is often defined as a gravity model. I think there can be a whole discussion about what actually constitutes a gravity model, because gravity models, just so you get a sense, it's a word you may hear often, it normally means that they look at migration as determined primarily by the size of source and destination of migrants and their geographical proximity. So normally when you look at size of countries and then geographic distance, that's a gravity model. Now, you often hear gravity models for things that don't actually do that. For instance, if we look at the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative model, in practice, it looks mostly at what in the literature was sometimes called as the push-pull factor. So you look at the factors that why people leave a certain place and why people are attracted by other places, and you also look at barriers. So I say this in the sense that you may hear a gravity model, it's sort of in the family of gravity models, not necessarily a gravity model per se. So the ACMI model, you can find it as part of the African Shifts report that is available online. It basically has 3 pillars. We look at climate hazards in origin areas, and that includes mostly droughts and floods. So a main limitation that we have is that we unfortunately do not have heat stress and water quality issues that are important but are not part of the model. And I take very seriously Robert's point that we really need to be open about what we know and we do not know about models, because numbers can be picked up easily, especially the higher end of ranges can be easily taken as the main message. So it's important to know and share what we know and what we don't know. So the first pillar is climate hazard in areas of origin. The second pillar is economic and livelihood impacts. In particular, we look at impacts of different hazards on crop production and livestock productivity. And then there's also a third pillar that is basically the social context. Now, for brevity, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but one of the interesting outcomes of the assessment that the team did not necessarily expect is that only 1% to 2% of mobility was actually international. So really almost 100% of the modeled and projected migration was internal in Africa. And this is interesting because this is shared by my colleagues just as we were discussing this session. Many countries felt, in fact, reassured by the fact that we're not talking about huge flows worldwide. It's really, in fact, primarily internal migration that you can expect. And the other thing that there was a lesson learned and not done fully, and this was also reflected by the previous speakers, is that for models to move forward, we really need to have localized vulnerability information. This is really crucial for more granular understanding. So, and this model is in 5-year intervals, if you see. So it's a different kind of angle from the maybe the displacement risk, and I would love to hear also from the other panelists. But I think, in fact, one of the problems I have seen in this space is that sometimes the family of models that we use to understand individual or single displacement events is quite different from what we use to project long-term. And it's not easy to integrate those two. Then the second modeling effort, which will be published by the end of 2024, so it's not published yet, is modeling done for the Greater Caribbean Climate Mobility Initiative, which is the second regional initiative of the Global Center for Climate Mobility. Here we took a different approach. It's a spatial general computation equilibrium model that basically you can think about it as it's like a puzzle where everything is related to everything else, and then when you change one of the parameters, it looks at how everything else adjusts, to put it very simply. And it's a quite standardized, standard approach that is taken in econometrics by many also international organizations that look at macroeconomic scenarios, for example. The core features is it basically looks at the economic sectors modeled at a 5 per 5 kilometer grid scale, which is the same scale that we have in the Africa model. And this is the relative localization is also because when we talk about, we look at the classic RCP and SSP scenarios that everybody uses for climate change and socioeconomic impacts, we try to understand also what we can expect in terms of local wage differentials and local production features. And the idea is that migration are primarily migration decisions are driven by economic considerations, particularly wage differentials. And we look at migration at local, national, international levels. Here, I think one of the important steps forward is that the model also allows us to look at immobility risks. And in particular, this is modeled, it's a little bit more of a technical reflection, but it's modeled mostly in terms of the decrease in opportunities in potential destination areas. That means that people may not actually have access, realistic access to alternatives to migrate. And this is a comprehensive model, step forward in many ways. The main disadvantage is that it looks at basically a 20 years interval to 2050. So it looks at a number of scenarios from now to 2050. So it doesn't look at the shorter term. Obviously, there's nothing about seasonal, circular migration. It just really looks at where we may be in 20 years. Now, lastly, just to share, as mentioned, I am editing a special issue on climate mobility modeling of the journal Frontiers in Climate. I believe 5 papers are already online. It's been an interesting effort because, of course, you can see a couple of the papers are even reviewed in quite simple terms, I want to say. So if anybody wants to learn about the pros and cons in a bit more detail than we can get to today of different approaches, there's a couple of very good review papers. The interesting lesson I learned was that a number of papers refer to the great potential of machine learning methods, in particular random forest models. It's also interesting that, to my awareness, this has not really been done. Although everybody says that it's a great opportunity, and I'm happy to stand corrected. So even for somebody like myself, I'm a quantitative economist, I've done a bit of modeling, I would have loved to see concretely. But this seems to be the direction that several experts in this field point to. The other thing that many point to is the fact that it's just very complex to do modeling, so you need to keep the qualitative element in and work on scenarios. It's really complicated to get to a specific number, and then that number, if it's specific, then it's misinterpreted and misunderstood, and that's another one. And what we do see already, and I think it's very important and promising, last point, is dynamic multi-scale models where really the local, regional, and national levels are increasingly integrated in a better way. I think in part because we have increasingly good granular geocoded data, meaning we can really, for any grid in the world, we can now overlay a number of different climatic, socioeconomic, even political variables that are increasingly localized. So I think that is the promising trend that I think is already taking place. Thanks also, I should have started this, thanks a lot to the organizers for having me today. And I look forward to a discussion with everybody in the audience. Thank you, Alvaro.
Yeah, thank you as well. I guess to all the speakers, just considering the mixed group of people that we have here today, we have a lot of information on what historic data is being collected and the importance of having modeling to understand how this is going to change in the future, how to also improve the data that is there. We have a very clear example of how modeling is being done at UNFCCC, how this is being done in a global approach, but it's mixing quantitative and qualitative to improve information on vulnerability. And we have at the end, Andrea letting us know 2 more regional approaches, case studies, let's say, in Africa and the Caribbean, and how they were very different as well, how different approaches to modeling were used. Just maybe from my experience working with risk management, most of these models are made to answer specific questions, so it is important to have all these modelings if we want to understand complexity from different levels. So it's really good to know all of these efforts that are going in that direction. I think in several directions. I'm taking the... we have a few more Menti questions. Actually, we had planned a little bit more of a World Cafe kind of situation going on now for you to interact directly with the speakers, but I'm afraid time is not going to allow it to go that deep. So what I would do is I'm going to continue with these questions just to grab a bit of your attention and your input, and then we're gonna just have a normal Q&A from your side to understand a bit what your questions, some of your questions. So what challenges do you see as the most pressing in addressing weather-related displacement? This question doesn't need to come from a quantitative or qualitative. It can be whatever your background is. Weather-related displacement. I think we had the conversation this morning about the difference between migration and displacement. Was a bit of a discussion this morning for those of you who could join us. Base data, storage and processing, efforts to develop the softwares. We have one answer, one there. I'm gonna just give a few seconds more, but then justice, uncertainty, data availability, resolution, preservation of effort to develop, short-term modeling. I don't know, for the speakers, if you have some reaction, I can just take one of yours. It seems like data, it's quite a challenge that some of members of our audience perceive. I don't know if you, Alex, would like to comment on that.
Thank you. I'm looking at the words as they come on the screen, and maybe I could speak to the issue of data availability and government action, because it was one of the points that I wanted to make as well earlier when I think we need to be very careful about understanding what these models can do and what they can't do. And let me just try and structure my thoughts a little bit. One of the things I wanted to say was, it's a question that came up in the previous side event on this topic, was the notion, I mean, we need to understand that the model, at least that we've developed, is not an agent-based model. So even though we are trying to better understand the vulnerability piece of the equation and trying to understand what are some of the key structural drivers that are determining the scale or that are likely to determine the scale of displacement in the future, this doesn't actually take into account people's choices, and the choices that they're going to make are going to vary certainly from country to country, from community to community, and even from person to person. So the limitations of the model is that not everyone is going to be affected in the same way, which is why drilling down on the vulnerability piece is so important, so that we can start showing who is most vulnerable and where the impacts are going to be the most severe, and what is likely to cause the highest risk of disaster displacement becoming protracted. Because one thing that we need to understand is that displacement isn't always necessarily a bad thing. In many contexts, displacement is actually a life-saving measure. If you think about a government preemptively or in the moment evacuating their population to avoid the harmful effects of a hazard when it hits, technically that is a form of displacement, but one can argue that it is a very preferable option to a higher mortality rate in certain disaster contexts. So not all displacement is necessarily bad. So even when we pull up this the global map with that shows the regions in the world that are likely to have the highest numbers of displacement, it doesn't necessarily mean that that is exactly where the attention should be focused. And that's where the vulnerability and the exposure pieces are extremely important. And for that, of course, you need a solid conceptual framework. So Rob pulled up the slide that shows the different components of vulnerability. So of course they're political, they're social, they're environmental, they're demographic, but they're so much more complex than that as well. They're very individual. And how do you quantify, how do you put data to illustrate all of those different components of vulnerability? I think it's fair to say that we'll never be able to capture that complexity perfectly. So so the availability of data, I think, for me is key for those reasons. And another point that I wanted to make, which connects to availability of data, but also to the point about government action, is that For now, this is a global disaster displacement risk model. And of course, the next step, which we're really hoping to get to, but that's going to require a lot more data and a lot more investment, that's going to be very costly, will be to translate the global model into national, a way of conducting national risk assessments that are country-specific, context-specific, and that can really equip governments with the information that they're going to need to plan for the future, but also to advocate for more pledges at COPs for losses and damages. This is literally what we're talking about here. But in order to translate the global risk model into national risk assessments, you need a lot more data. And even if in a hypothetical ideal world, even if we had all the data that we needed at the national level to conduct perfectly comprehensive national risk assessments, what would then be the uptake? How would that then effectively feed into policy? And this is another big question that maybe a more of an existential one for IDMC, but for all of us working on the research side. It was a conversation that we had this morning in another side event. How do you really effectively connect data and evidence to action and political action? I think we can all agree, the science is there. We're still waiting for political action. So again, limitations of these types of models. They're very useful, I think, for having a broad sense of possible scenarios, but they're going to need much more work and much more nuances in order to become really effective planning tools.
Thank you, Alex. So just I take from my side that yes, there's data missing, but it's also about how to interpret that data, what it means and what it doesn't, and how to, the use cases of that data. So 3, let's say, efforts that need to go in parallel in order to go to this government action that it's also was the most, let's say, voted word. We have another question. It's this one, it's a range there that you will get. How useful displacement model results are for policy making? I think this is a bit of a controversial one. I've heard different opinions on this ones, but I think it would be good to capture the opinion of the room. We have 3 answers going 4.7. Very useful, sounds like as of now it's going a little lower. Okay, I think this one should go maybe to Rob. How do you feel? How can you react to this?
Thanks. Yeah, so 4.1 out of 5. Yeah, not bad. I think it's good. Yeah. Yeah, maybe before the session you were only 3.2 or something. Yeah, I am a supporter of using them, but using them carefully. And I think one of the reasons, going back to the previous slide, working out when the subjective threshold is passed, that someone has to move or wants to move. But as Alexandra says, I mean, how do you get data for that? At the global level, we have to get indicators that are available. If and when we have more intense work with countries, we can get more data. Ideally, we would, of course, have on-the-ground fieldwork data. That would be lovely. That's what we've done previously in a project working with Andrea, actually, in the Pacific. But I think if we are going to models, people are going to make models. That's what modelers do. And it's interesting, sometimes as someone who researches in this field, you see a model that's produced by maybe a physicist who doesn't really know about human mobility, and it can be a really well thought out model, but from my perspective, they're not maybe understanding the whole complexity involved, the whole nuance. So I think it's important that those who are really kind of in the field do produce these. Otherwise, those models are coming from anywhere, they're coming from other sources. Economists do some good stuff too, but you need economists, you need geographers, you need migration experts, and you need to try and bring in the experts on the ground as well, affected people, trying to understand their decisions, their thresholds as well.
We have a third question here. What key feature would make a displacement model more useful in your work? So we saw here we have some academics here, people belonging to NGOs and other. I see the room has changed a little bit in who was there at the beginning and who joined us later. Keywords. Andrea, this question, the response, I'm hoping to get your your reaction, but in between, do you have any comment from the question before the answer? The room seems to think that the models are quite necessary for decision making and could be very useful. I see you also have a couple of them have a reaction to that high level of necessity that the room feels for this modeling.
Yes, and actually this question in a way is quite related, so I can probably answer also relating to the last question. I think a first reflection I would share on this is that I believe it's important that those of us who have the privilege to have one foot in academia and one foot in the more academic world, we have to be intellectually honest in terms of when are we developing models because we're trying to learn how to do this properly, and when are we developing models where we do feel confident that if a policymaker needs to work in whatever his or her field may be, having this model, despite the uncertainty, will give us at the very least some ranges that are more useful than not doing anything at all. Because I remember this conversation with a senior colleague recently who were reminding me that on the one hand, sometimes, especially in the UN world, you feel like, unless you produce, it's not like in the academia, unless you produce something, then policymakers will work with nothing. But one thing to think about is that when you're projecting something, there is also a baseline, which is you can just literally project what has happened in the past, in the future, right? So if you are doing a model, it has to give a bit of certainty that you're doing something better than just projecting what the past was. I say this because I do sometimes see very ambitious models with methods that I think are not aligned. So first thing is, in order to be useful, a displacement model has to be good enough that it has to give something positive that compensates for the possible false certainty that a policymaker has by looking at some numbers. We really need to say what we know and what we don't know. And then I think the points that we see on the screen are in fact quite important. Open access and code is one I'm a big fan of. I've seen an increasing trend in that sense, and I think it's absolutely central. We need to be able to have both the subject matter experts look at the models and point out when something doesn't make sense, and we also need the most advanced mathematicians and modelers be able to look at what institutes that have a lot of subject matter expertise may have done, but that from a data and methodological perspective is not good enough. And because we all talk about interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, etc., but in practice, you have to also just have things online and people can check it out, even if they're not in the same institute. And the local specificity is the other one that I would highlight, and I think both Alexandra and Robert were pointing it out. In order for models to be useful, they have to be granular. There's not much that you can do by saying 150 million people will displace. No, it's going to be 140 or 210 million or 60 million. Nobody can do anything with any of those that becomes advocacy. So if you want something to be useful for work, it has to be granular. So that element of local specificity and the granularity, I would really distill as the key issue.
Transparency and granularity. Actually, we are almost done with our time for today, but I'm going to steal 5 minutes maybe to some questions from the audience. I see we already have 2 hands, 3 hands, 4 hands. Oh. Is there a second mic? Oh, there are mics coming, yes. I'm going to collect first the questions and then for you to answer. So we start, please.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was truly insightful. I am Valentina Ospina. I am an academic from Colombia, but I previously worked with NRC, that is in the same office as IDMC. So I worked really closely with all the things that IDMC produces in my daily research. And my question is mainly about the modeling, because the numbers that are projected in 30 years or 40 years, are these considering that many times climate migration is not permanent migration or protracted migration, as we see when we analyze conflict migration per se? So are these numbers considering the numbers of returnees in the sense that you are kind of subtracting them from the final number, or how are you projecting those returnees? Because many times when it's climate, it is just temporary. Many times it can become, of course, protected, but this is an important differentiation. And my very short second question would be, are there any plans to maybe apply this model to more short-term results? Because, for example, right now Colombia is having a very harsh climate crisis in the center of the country and in the coastal areas. And I feel that these tools would have been very useful in a situation like this. So short-term would be a very good investment for researchers to also develop this model in both ways. Thank you.
Thank you. There's also a question in the back, if you can.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Dom Dussault. I'm a researcher within the RISK program at Woodwell Climate Research Center. My question is about the validation of these models. Obviously, no model is perfect, but some can be useful. What type of validation is done, and how well do these models perform, is my question. Thanks.
Thank you. I saw another hand, maybe for the last question. Here, please.
Hi, thank you for the discussion. I'm Lauren Grant, founder of the Beyond Climate Collaborative and the International School on Climate Mobilities. Not that I'm at all an expert on modeling, but I do have a question, and I hope I'm not going to cause too much provocation here. But Alexandra, you just mentioned the goal would be to model at the national level to the point that we can directly inform national policy frameworks. Andrea, on the other hand, you're representing the GCCM, who I understand, at least through the ACMI modeling work, has done qualitative research to complement the modeling findings, and then is working actually in partnership with African governments at the federal level to influence policy developments and kind of policy blueprint frameworks at the moment from your modeling findings, complemented from the qualitative findings. So I'm just wondering if you can speak a little bit to, maybe it precedes also your time there at GCCM, but if you can speak to kind of anything about the process of the team there in actually feeling confident to move ahead in seeking partnership with the African governments to work on their policy blueprints with the findings that you guys had in hand.
Thank you. So I will start with Alex. We had some concrete questions about short-term modeling and about the consideration of those who migrate and then return back to their home countries or home places.
Thanks. That's a great question. Well, I can start by saying that all the data that we have today on disaster displacement that has already happened does not give us, is not granular enough at this stage to give us an indication of who stays displaced for a long period of time. So we have an idea of the total number of people who become displaced following a certain disaster. But typically, even in the best case scenarios where you have the strongest data systems with very strong national databases counting people who have been evacuated, let's say after typhoon. I'm thinking, for example, about countries like the Philippines or Indonesia that have very strong national disaster loss databases and evacuation registries. Typically, that monitoring trails off a few days, usually between 30 and 60 days after a disaster strikes. And that monitoring trails off because national governments and even lesser local governments do not have the capacity to keep track over long periods of time. And especially in countries that are highly hazard prone, like the Philippines, when that starts trailing off, it's usually because another disaster has already hit and the counter has gone back to zero and they have to start monitoring the next one. So what we're facing at IDMC is a huge gap in our knowledge of the duration of displacement. And we've had to actually infer that duration with many proxy indicators, like, for example, the level of destruction of a house. And we've had to assume that, for example, if someone's house is totally destroyed, they will be less like, it will take them longer to rebuild it, and therefore it will take them longer to return home. Whereas someone whose house is partially destroyed will be able to perhaps return and live in a partially destroyed home and while they're rebuilding. And again, different from someone who's simply been evacuated for a short period, and then when the disaster has passed, they've been able to go back because their home hasn't been destroyed. So there are multiple scenarios, and unfortunately, no data to actually allow us to quantify that systematically from country to country, and certainly not at the global level, which is why at this point in time, IDMC and the world only has strong figures for, it's not short term, but for that initial peak of displacement following a disaster, so what we call the flow, and much less data on the stock, so the total number of people who are still displaced today. And that's the big difference between the disaster displacement data and the conflict displacement data. The conflict displacement data is much more about stocks than it is in a disaster context. So, because that data is unavailable as of today, it means that that's not the data that has gone into the model. So the model itself cannot project and anticipate for how long people are likely to be displaced, right, Rob? I think it can only show what is the likely maximum amount of displacement to be expected over a short period. And this is exactly why the vulnerability piece of the equation is so important to us, because that is exactly what can then, if we manage to get that at a more granular level, we will be able to infer and make assumptions about the duration of displacement, because the number of days or weeks or months that someone stays displaced depends not just on their ability to rebuild their homes, it depends on whether or not they have access to insurance, whether or not their home has been destroyed in an area that has become uninhabitable. And all of those elements are socioeconomic and sort of environmental indicators that currently are not they're not available and therefore not computed fully into the model. I hope that answers your question.
So I think this is going to be a bit unfair because I'm going to accumulate the question for the next one. So both, I'm going to ask you about the validation question that we had here about models being not perfect but useful, but also maybe if you can comment a little bit on these assumptions, and then the question on the short-term projections. So I make it harder for you, but don't worry, Andrea will have it even harder. So.
Okay, yeah, so temporality is something that we recognize is really important, and it's planned, but as Alexandra said, it requires, a slightly different framework, slightly different data that we don't have, but yeah. So we've just finished stage one. So there was the model that Alexandra mentioned from 2017. We've just kind of restarted doing that work, and initially we have something that we're quite happy with, but we're moving on through the next. In fact, that links to the validation question. So there's always a question about validation. I should have read up on this. So I haven't done the modeling. However, I know that it performs quite well relative to the old model, and I suppose I was working more with the drought, and there's a bit of using data for calibration and validation. I think it's quite nice, but we're not publishing that yet. We're going to validate it again. We're going to develop it in the future. So the next stage, a few more hazards, and eventually we're going to also look at duration. Short term, I guess what we're getting is a snapshot of vulnerability. We have the exposure data, and if we can import some hazard data, yes. I suppose it's just what is that for exactly? Are we trying to warn governments that this hurricane is going to displace this many people? I don't know if that's the most useful use for this data. It may be sufficient to say that there's a big risk because the storm's going to hit this area. Maybe we don't want to overcomplicate things. I'm not sure, actually. I haven't really thought about it in that way. Am I forgetting something?
I think we don't have that much time, and we want to hear about Andrea. So if I understood the question correctly, how far are we from giving the governments directly information that is useful for them to make decisions, something on that line? And then if you have any comment on the previous questions, that also would be useful.
Then I'll be quick. So on validation, now the Africa Climate Mobility Model is in fact born out of the Groundswell model. So, I mean, you find a lot more detail if you look at the original Groundswell model produced by the World Bank, where you basically see that it's been checked for historical consistency, meaning it looks at how it looks at the past, real-world alignment. So, for instance, you have DESA estimates, OECD estimates, so a number of variables against which you can check the extent to which it works. In the case of the global, of the Greater Caribbean modeling, this is mostly what has been done in the validation, and the report that is coming in the next couple of weeks, you have all the details. For the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative, if you look at the groundswell that is behind, there was also extensive expert consultation. You find also a lot of detail on sensitivity testing, so there's more detail on that because it was a broader effort. In terms of the basically the confidence in the model to be used as a basis for policy, now I don't. How can I say? I mean, the numbers that you see in the model are not directly linked to the policy-making efforts, because the main way in which this happens is there's a regional model that is developed, and then from the regional level with the global center, what we do is we then bring this up to the global level in a number of ways, advocacy, etc., and then we do what we call the deep dives in the country level, starting with the policy blueprint and then concrete programs. Now, the model helps to get a sense of the problems that are there. It helps identify the hotspots that will be prioritized for deep dives. But I wouldn't say that the numbers of the estimates guide, because it's not like we're supporting building water infrastructure for city X, Y, or Z, expecting that there would be 300,000 people more rather than 100,000. The policy work is not so granular in its relationship to the data. Therefore, we feel confident that the analysis, qualitative and quantitative, gives us the picture we need for evidence-based policy work and then the projects on the field. So we're confident about that.
Thank you so much, Andrea, and the rest of the panel. Also, thanks to the Capacity Building Hub for providing the space, and thanks of you to joining us in a Saturday afternoon. So a clap for everyone, I think.